I thought this dinner would impress him. But as he humiliated me and she laughed along,
I used to think that humiliation only came from enemies, from people who actively wished you harm. I learned in the most painful way that sometimes it comes from the very person who is supposed to protect you the most. The dinner was my wife's idea. She told me it was crucial for her career, that her boss wanted to get to know us better. I agreed without a second thought. I had always been her biggest supporter, championing her ambitions even when they took up most of her time and energy. That night I put on my best shirt, the one she always said she liked. I went over polite conversation topics in my head, reminding myself it was just one evening, a small price to pay for her happiness and success. But the moment her boss walked through our front door, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. He carried himself with a kind of overwhelming confidence that demanded attention, not because he'd earned it, but because he just expected it. His smile was wide, but it never quite reached his eyes. When he shook my hand, his grip lingered just a fraction of a second too long, feeling less like a greeting and more like a quiet challenge. At first, the comments were subtle, little jokes wrapped in polite laughter. He'd ask questions about my work that sounded innocent on the surface but were loaded with judgment. I answered calmly, trying not to read too much into his tone. But every time I spoke, my wife would jump in. She'd correct me, simplify what I said as if I were a child, or laugh it off like I was just being amusing instead of serious. That's when I felt the first knot tighten in my stomach. Something was very wrong. As the night wore on, her boss grew bolder. He started talking over me, dismissing my opinions outright. He made remarks that were clearly designed to paint him as the successful alpha in the room, and me as a mere afterthought. And with each jab, my wife just smiled. Sometimes she'd even laugh. Once, she actually added to his joke, turning me into the punchline in my own home. My chest felt tight, like a band was squeezing my lungs. But I stayed quiet. I didn't want to embarrass her. I didn't want to come across as insecure or overly sensitive. But that silence, I would soon learn, cost me far more than any argument ever could have. The breaking point arrived with a single comment. Her boss remarked how lucky my wife was to be so driven, with a heavy implication that she had long outgrown me. The table went silent. Everyone was waiting for my reaction. But before I could even open my mouth to respond, my wife let out a little laugh. She said something about how I was simple but dependable. Simple. The word hung in the air. I looked at her, searching for any trace of the woman I had married, the woman I loved. All I saw was someone desperate for approval, willing to stand on my dignity just to reach a little higher. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw insults. I just stood up from the table and calmly said, "I think the evening is over." The look of pure shock on her boss's face was almost comical. My wife, however, stared at me as if I had just committed an unforgivable crime. After they left, she exploded. She accused me of ruining her chances, of embarrassing her in front of someone so important, of not understanding how much her career meant. I let her vent, listening quietly. When she finally ran out of steam, I asked her one simple question. Why did you think humiliating me was an acceptable price to pay for it? She had no answer. That night, I slept on the couch. It wasn't a mutual decision. I just suddenly felt like a complete stranger in my own bedroom, in my own home. The days that followed were heavy with an unbearable silence. She tried to act like everything was normal, but I couldn't. Something fundamental between us had shifted, had broken. I started replaying moments from our past, like a film reel in my mind. All the times I'd brushed off her dismissive comments as just jokes. All the times I'd laughed along when she made me seem smaller in front of our friends. I realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't new. It had been happening for years. I had just finally stopped ignoring it. A week later, I told her I needed space. I explained it wasn't a punishment, but a necessity. I needed to figure out if our marriage still had a foundation built on mutual respect, or if it had crumbled away without me even noticing. She cried. She apologized profusely. She promised it would never, ever happen again. And I believe she was sorry, I really did. But I also understood a hard truth: regret doesn't erase patterns. It doesn't magically fix the underlying issues that led to the behavior in the first place. The time away gave me a clarity I hadn't had in years. Without the constant, subtle dismissal, I started to remember who I was. I reconnected with old friends who valued my thoughts. I threw myself into my work and hobbies, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, a genuine confidence, not born from arrogance, but from self-worth. Funny enough, her boss eventually faded from the picture. Office politics shifted, new priorities emerged, and he was gone. It's amazing how temporary the people who demand so much loyalty often are. My wife tried to rebuild what she had broken. This time her efforts felt real. She started defending me in conversations, setting boundaries with people, and acknowledging her behavior without making excuses. But some wounds don't bleed loudly. They just ache quietly, constantly reminding you of what you once tolerated. We went to counseling. We had more honest conversations in those few months than we'd had in years. And in the safety of that space, I realized something both painful and liberating. Love, on its own, is not enough to sustain a relationship when respect is conditional. We didn't end things with a dramatic fight. We separated with a deep sadness, but also with mutual understanding and acceptance. She wasn't a villain, and I wasn't a victim. We were just two people who had completely lost sight of what a true partnership is supposed to be. Today, my life is much calmer. I speak my mind freely. I no longer shrink myself to make other people feel more comfortable or powerful. I've learned that real strength isn't about dominating a room or tearing someone else down to build yourself up. It's about knowing your own worth and having the courage to refuse to let anyone, even someone you love, take it away from you. That terrible dinner didn't destroy me. In the end, it did the opposite. It reminded me of who I am. Thanks for listening to my story. If you've ever felt something similar, know that you're not alone and your feelings are valid. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. See you next time.